how can we improve school funding across the state? Would you support or change the education cost-sharing formula that the state uses to distribute funds to municipalities for education?
I would change it. A lot of changes were already made with the most recent ECS formula, which make it a lot more fair. But one of the biggest challenges right now, I think, has to do with how poverty is being weighted and measured as the federal standards are changing. I'm trying to think how to describe this very quickly, but as the federal standard of poverty has basically dropped, is the simplest way of saying it, a lot of people are now being left out of the equation, whereas it is still very difficult, or it costs more to educate them. So I would want to look at how we can close that gap and figure out a new standard. I think the other thing that is going to keep coming down the horizon has to do with special education. The number of students being put in that class keeps growing, and it's the fastest growing population in the schools. And right now, the formula is taking that into account, but as that population grows, we won't be able to keep pace, so we'll have to fix that as well.
Ms. Lavielle.
Thank you. This is something that I've spent a lot of time on, and I anticipate spending more time on it. There are a lot of inequities in this formula, which has just become a patchwork over the years of various carve-outs for different towns. There is clearly a mismatch in many cases between the measure for household income in a town and the property values. Many times there is a big incongruity. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the city of Norwalk, which has a very high level of property values, but very low household income, a very high number of students on free and reduced lunch, in other words, a poverty measure, a very high measure of kids whose first language is not English, students that have more expensive needs. And we've got to look at this formula and adjust it for these factors. It has become extremely inequitable across the state in various cases. The formula has also not been fully funded in years, so the amount of money that's supposed to go to it isn't there, and a lot of districts are underfunded as a result. We need to put more money into education, which I hope we can do as we grow the economy. That should be a priority. And we should also look at some ways, I think, to organize special education a little bit more regionally for some services, because those costs are clearly growing way out of what we're going to be able to control.
Okay, thank you. That's time. Mr. Haskell.
So education is the best investment that we can make as a society, and I say that as a proud graduate of the Westport Public Schools. The problem is in Connecticut, we have some wonderful schools that are huge draws to communities like ours in Wilton and Westport and Weston, and yet so close by, other schools are falling behind. My parents are divorced, and I was registered to live at my mom's house in Westport, so I got to go to one of the best public high schools in the country where there was a smart board in every classroom. But had I been registered to live at my dad's house, I would have gone in Bridgeport, only 10 minutes away. I would have gone to one of the worst public high schools in the country, in a district that's been in deficit by $2 billion for the last 10 years. This is not only a moral failing in Connecticut, it's also a bad economic policy. There's too much wasted economic potential in our cities. We should be investing in students. That's why I have called for a comprehensive reform to the education cost-sharing formula that begins with the very basic question of how much it costs to educate a student. That's what Massachusetts did in the 90s, and as a result, they entirely revamped the way that they fund education. They rely less heavily than Connecticut now on property taxes, and it's really worked out in that state. I think that we should follow their example and make public education for all a promise so that your zip code does not determine your educational prospects or opportunities.
Okay. Ms. Boucher.
All parents want the best possible education for their children. It's the reason that I first ran for the Board of Education, later serving on the State Board of Education, and as ranking member and now co-chair of the Education Committee of the Legislature. I am intimately familiar with the education cost-sharing formula when it was devised in order to equalize education across Connecticut schools, particularly the inner city. And we had a lot of buy-in, even by affluent communities. What started off as a good formula turned into a very political formula with 45 various variables. Every year it changed. The one good outcome of an 18-18 tie in the Senate is it forced compromise, and it forced compromise on a new ECS formula that we put together, in fact, wrote, and I was a part of that, to, again, bring fairness and equity to all of our schools instead of just giving the funds to that particular district who happened to have a leader in a particular party on that committee. That's just downright wrong. And this governor proposed twice to send $400 million transfer costs that the state has borne since 1970 onto our towns and schools, which would devastate our school budgets and our property taxes. We stopped that, and we brought funds back to our underfunded schools and arrived at a new ECS formula. We have a lot more work to do on that. It's something I'd like to roll up my sleeves and continue, because education continues to drive my passion for public service.
Thank you. Mr. Tartell.
We were deciding who goes first. So with the ECS formula, we need to fund education. Connecticut has the second highest of income inequality in the nation. And the biggest way, the best way, the most effective way to close that gap is by giving people the knowledge, the tools, so they can succeed in life. And the best way to do that is through education. If you don't invest in education, then you got to invest in courts, because that's the only way they will get redress. So let's invest in education. I was involved in long-range planning teams in the Wilton School District for 22 years. And in 2000, we had 9 children on the autism spectrum. I think that's changed. We need to be able to fund special education on a much more regional basis, because school districts in and of themselves can no longer bear the burden. It's important to create a personal, close, specialized, flexible approach to creating a learning environment for each child, but the funding and the resources need to be spread across the larger region so we can do the allocation of those resources and funding to make that work. Finally, it's a leadership issue. If you look at how things get funded, I'm not a fan of Malloy, and he has really messed up the leadership of this state, and I'm very happy that he is not running again.
Okay. Mr. O'Day.
Another thing Ross and I agree with. No, honestly, I do want to say it is having the choice, and all of us up here running for election, we've all, I think, given you a good snapshot on who we are, and I'm very proud to be up here with all the candidates. And I certainly wasn't meaning to slight Will for running his age. If he doesn't hold my age against me, I won't hold his age against him. But as far as the ECS formula, I'm holding it right here. I'm looking at it. Literally, the base amount is $11,525, okay? And this is and then they look at English language learner, poverty weight, poverty measure. What I'm saying is it's not necessarily a problem with the formula. We've literally, the Republicans put forth a formula. If it wasn't for Tony being the deciding vote in the Senate, the governor would have been able to sweep away all the money that Wilton got and all the money New Canaan got, which is about $1.5 million for each in the middle of the budget cycle. That would have impacted your taxes. I see I have 30 seconds. But so it's not necessarily the ECS formula that's the problem. What I see is a bloated administration, because under state law, you can't reduce funding to the Board of Ed unless you're in one of the top 10% school districts. And so what's happened over time is we've had a bloated bureaucracy that has gotten away from educating our children. We need to address that across the board and allow districts more flexibility in trimming the fat at the top. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Is there any rebuttal on this one? Yes, Ms. Lavielle?
Thank you. We've been talking about funding so much, and I would just like to add, because I spent so much time on the Education Committee, that a lot can be solved with money, but not everything. And in education, there are so many other factors that we have to take into account as well. Much of it is the excessive amount of administration and data collection and reporting that teachers have to do every day that is keeping them out of their classrooms. They don't get enough to spend enough time with students anymore. Also, we've piled an awful lot of duties onto our schools that go way past academics, that go way past even schooling, anything. All of this deserves a very close look and a very really intense scrutiny. There's still a lot of work we have to do, thank goodness. I think that since I've been on the Education Committee, it's become one of the most bipartisan or nonpartisan committees in the entire legislature, and I certainly hope we can keep it that way.
Okay, and that's time. Any other rebuttal or extension? Yes, Mr. Haskell, this would be your last one. Go ahead.
I'll just, I'm not rebutting anything that was said on stage. I just want to add that it isn't just about reforming the education cost-sharing formula. There are out-of-school factors that contribute to the low reading rates and poor math performance of low-income and English second language students. That's why we need an investment in early childhood education, because so much of the gap that we see in outcomes emerges before students even get into the classroom. It's also why we need paid family leave, because making sure that no parent has to choose between advancing in their career and starting a family, making sure that they have time to bond with their child before going off to work. 25% of American moms have to go back to work just 2 weeks after their child is born. That's a problem because so much brain development happens in the early phases of life. So we need desperately to pass paid family leave to close educational outcomes and reduce the gap between poor students and wealthy students.
Okay, anything further? Anybody? Mr. O'Day, I guess you do have a rebuttal available.
Just briefly on the discretionary spending, I've got a chart, so everybody should read the Connecticut Commission on Fiscal Stability and Economic Growth. It's a final report dated March of 2018. Honestly, just Google it. It's the most important report the state has put out potentially in the last 20 years. And what that report says is that discretionary spending has now been outpaced by our fixed costs for the first time in 2017. So literally, for us to turn the lights on, pay our debt, and pay for the employees, it's now taking up 53% of our budget, okay? So paid family medical leave is a wonderful concept, but guess how many private businesses will be able to afford that? They'll go out of business if they have to provide paid family leave. I work 2 jobs. My wife works 2 jobs, so I can work 2 jobs. I'm up here losing money from my profession as a lawyer, but my wife is taking up the slack and working 2 jobs. We need to create more jobs in the state, not less.